Gray light filtered through the narrow windows of Seacliff Correctional Facility, casting a pale hush over the concrete walls. The dawn was quiet, as if even the sun hesitated to witness what the morning would bring. Mason Reed lay awake on the steel bed of his cell, his eyes locked on the ticking clock. 6:00 a.m. In 3 hours, the state would take his life. He hadn't begged. Not when the appeals failed. Not when the final date was set. But now, facing the end, his voice low and weathered, had cracked only once. "Please, let me see, Ranger." Warden Blackwood's face, typically carved from stone, flickered. A pause. A rare softness. Then she nodded. "I'll call Ms. Porter." That single decision uncoiled something dormant in Mason's chest. He closed his eyes. His final request wasn't meant for redemption. It was for a goodbye. Years earlier, Mason had stood tall in a different uniform, his Navy SEAL insignia stitched over his heart. He'd been fearless overseas, but it was back home in Oceanside, where the invisible wounds bled. PTSD gnawed at his sleep. The only balm came in the form of a scarred German Shepherd Ranger. Ranger wasn't just a dog. He was a comrade. A kindred soul with amber eyes that had seen things no living thing should. Mason had found him in a shelter slated for euthanasia because of his disfigured muzzle. But Mason had seen the truth in those eyes. "He's still got love in him," he'd whispered to Abby that day, his fiancée. Abby Porter had loved them both, man and dog. A schoolteacher with kind hands and a spine of iron, she'd stood by Mason through nightmares and courtrooms. Their engagement party was 2 weeks before everything fell apart. A powerful developer murdered. A fingerprint. A rushed trial. A cell. Now 5 years later, Abby stirred awake to the phone's ring. Her hand trembled. "This is Warden Blackwood," the voice said. "Mason Reed has requested to see his dog. We understand you have custody." "Yes," Abby said softly. Her throat clenched. "You have 2 hours." She didn't move at first, just stared at the photo on her nightstand. Mason kneeling beside Ranger, both faces lit with a rare peace. She rose and crossed to the living room. Ranger lay curled on his old bed, eyes still sharp despite the graying fur. "We're going to see him, boy." Abby whispered, her voice cracking. At the sound of Mason's name, Ranger lifted his head. His ears perked. He didn't need words to understand. He was ready. Across town, long before sunrise, Detective Warren Harlow stood in his dimly lit office files, scattered like the debris of second thoughts. For 5 years, he'd lived with the certainty that Mason Reed was guilty. A fingerprint, a motive, witnesses. But lately, that certainty had begun to rot. Something about the case had never fully settled. That morning, as Mason's execution loomed, Harlow's instincts screamed loud enough to wake him before dawn. He flipped through the yellowed evidence logs until his finger stopped. A notation. Unidentified fingerprints marked inconclusive in a strangely fresh red pen. "Inconclusive, my ass," he muttered, grabbing his phone. Back at Abby's home, the morning light spilled gently across the hardwood floor. Ranger stood by the front door, stiff but alert, his tail slowly wagging. Abby knelt and clipped on his leash, pausing to bury her face in his fur. "You've been waiting 5 years for this," she whispered. As she stepped outside, her thoughts spun with everything unsaid. The test results from the vet, 6 months left, maybe less. She hadn't told Mason. It felt too cruel to add another goodbye. At the prison, Warden Blackwood waited at the front gate as Abby and Ranger arrived. The German Shepherd stood taller now, alert, as though reporting for duty. The guard stiffened as he passed, but the warden merely nodded. "You'll have 15 minutes, she said. "Follow me." Abby clutched Ranger's leash tighter. Each checkpoint echoed with metallic finality. Thick doors slammed shut behind them one by one, and Ranger's nose twitched constantly, hunting for a familiar scent, lost to time. At the final hallway, Abby stopped. Through a narrow window in the door, she saw Mason, orange jumpsuit, slumped shoulders, a man unrecognizable except for the way he held his spine upright, like he owed it to the boy he used to be. "You ready?" the warden asked gently. Abby nodded, voice caught in her throat. The door opened, and Ranger froze. Ranger stood rooted to the spot, his entire frame vibrating with something ancient and primal. His amber eyes locked onto Mason across the small cell, 5 years of waiting condensed into a single suspended breath. Then he broke. With a sound between a cry and a howl, Ranger lunged. Abby barely had time to unclasp the leash before the dog hurled himself into Mason's arms, his massive body quaking. Mason dropped to his knees as Ranger buried his face in his chest, whining, licking, trembling so desperate it bordered on pain. "Hey, buddy." Mason choked voice torn raw. "Hey there, my good boy." His arms wrapped around Ranger, like lifelines. Ranger pawed at his chest, circled twice, then pressed into him again, muzzle tight against Mason's ribs, as if scent alone could prove it was real. From the doorway, Abby watched in silence. The tears flowed freely now. She said nothing. She didn't have to. Behind her, the guards looked away, the moment too naked, too sacred for official eyes. "He remembered me," Mason whispered, stunned. "Every day," Abby replied. "He waits by the window every single day." Ranger went still. Then suddenly he shoved his nose into the breast pocket of Mason's jumpsuit and began to paw, focused, insistent. "What's he doing?" asked the warden. "I don't know," Mason murmured. He reached into the pocket and pulled out a scrap of worn brown leather. "They let me keep this. From my old jacket." The moment the fabric appeared, Ranger's behavior shifted. He stared at it, his body trembling again, not with joy this time, but something deeper. A memory triggered, a scent recalled. He turned sharply to Abby, then back to Mason, then to the scrap eyes wide, almost desperate. "He's trying to tell us something," Abby breathed. The cell door creaked open again. "Warden, a guard interrupted. Detective Harlow is here. Says it's urgent. About Reed." Blackwood's brow furrowed. "And Ranger," he growled. Not at the guard, not at the room, but at the old fabric in Mason's hand. Something was coming undone. Detective Harlow stood in the warden's office, hunched over a stack of printouts. The clock behind him read 8:17 a.m., just 43 minutes before the execution. "I need you to look at this," he said, laying out the evidence like a battlefield map. Cell tower pings from the night of the murder burner phone, registered to a Wilson Grant, places him near Montgomery's penthouse at the exact time of death. Warden Blackwood's face tightened. That name never came up during the trial. "Exactly," Harlow said, "because someone made sure it didn't." He tapped a highlighted section. "Grant's a known fixer. Cleans up messes for powerful people. Disappeared right after Reed's conviction." Blackwood's silence said more than words. Reed wasn't just a condemned man anymore. He was a thread unraveling something much larger. "He's with his fiancée and dog now," she said quietly. "They deserve every second." In the holding cell, Mason hadn't moved. Ranger lay pressed against his side, protective and still. Abby leaned closer, brushing a tear from her cheek. "There's something I need to tell you," she whispered. Mason turned to her, alarm softening his features. She took his hand and gently guided it to her stomach. "I found out 3 weeks ago," she said. "I'm pregnant, Mason." His face froze. Joy, disbelief, and heartache flooded his expression all at once. His hand trembled where it rested. "A baby," he rasped. "Our baby." Ranger whimpered and nudged between them, as if sensing the weight of the moment. "I wanted you to know," Abby said, voice cracking, "that a part of you will live on, no matter what happens." Mason's fingers brushed her cheek. "I'm so sorry to leave you both." The door opened again. Warden Blackwood entered, her tone composed but urgent. "Mr. Reed, new information has come forward. I've contacted the governor's office. We've received a temporary 2-hour stay of execution." Abby gasped, gripping Mason's hand tightly. Ranger lifted his head, ears perked, sensing the shift in the air. Mason blinked. "Detective Harlow, the one who arrested me." Blackwood nodded. "He's found evidence that may not have been reviewed at trial. He's in my office." Digging deeper, and for the first time in years, Mason felt it, a flicker of something fragile. Hope. Detective Harlow's voice was sharp over the phone. "I need confirmation on evidence log 47B. Gunpowder residue was found at the scene, even though Montgomery was stabbed." His free hand trembled with urgency as he flipped through an unmarked file revealing the second forensic report, buried, ignored, and damning. "This was never brought to trial," he muttered. On the other end of the line, the evidence was transferred due to contamination concerns. Signed off by Gregory Whitman. Harlow's jaw tightened. The district attorney himself had buried it. His eyes flicked to the wall clock, 8:52 a.m. 8 minutes until Mason's original execution time. Inside the visitation room, time was moving slower. Mason sat on the edge of his chair, fingers entwined with Abby's Ranger, resting his heavy head across Mason's lap. Every so often, the dog would twitch or whine, quietly alert, but waiting. These minutes, Mason whispered, "They're a gift." Abby squeezed his hand. "It's not over. We still have time. Don't hope too much," he said gently. "I can't bear to see you hurt again." Ranger suddenly sat up. His body stiffened. A soft whine built in his throat. Seconds later, Reverend Sullivan entered. "Mason," he said, eyes kind. "Detective Harlow has questions about the leather jacket you wore the day of the murder." Mason frowned. "My jacket? The cops took it after I was arrested." "He thinks it might explain the gunpowder at the scene," the Reverend said. "From your job at the range." Mason's eyes widened. "I trained at the range that morning, but no one ever asked." Abby sat forward, her voice rising. "Mason, remember that night? When you came home late from the consultation, Ranger wouldn't stop pawing at your jacket. I thought he was just playing. He was trying to tell us something," Abby said, trembling. "I locked it in the closet to stop him. But what if he smelled something we didn't?" Ranger whimpered again and pressed his muzzle into Mason's chest pocket. The jacket, the scent, the truth buried in cloth and time. Outside the prison walls, protesters gathered. Some shouted for justice, others prayed for mercy. But inside the concrete and steel, a dog had already begun to uncover what the justice system had missed. The call came fast. Harlow's expression shifted from urgency to shock. "You're certain?" he asked the forensics lab. "Send everything. Now." He turned to Warden Blackwood as she re-entered, her face tight. Montgomery was planning to expose a massive corruption scheme, coastal real estate. His partners had everything to lose. Reed. He was just the convenient fall guy. Blackwood's lips thinned, and someone on the inside helped frame him. The clock read 10:15 a.m. "We need more time," Harlow said, his voice like steel. "Much more than an hour." Back in the visitation room, Mason sat between silence and storm. Ranger never left his side. Abby watched him with a calm that masked the war behind her eyes. "I remembered something else," she said suddenly. "The night Ranger was so focused on your jacket. It wasn't just once. It was like he knew." Mason nodded slowly. "But I wasn't there. I never went to Montgomery's that night." Abby leaned forward. "But someone could have planted something, used your jacket while you were away." Ranger sensed it. Ranger, hearing his name, sat up again. He patted toward the crime scene photo Harlow had left earlier and sniffed it with eerie focus, then began pawing at it. "He keeps doing that," Abby whispered, "like he knows it matters." Harlow burst into the room. "The watch," he said, breathless. "Montgomery's Rolex. You told the Reverend something about it. Mason blinked. He was obsessive about it, always locked it in his safe. But in the crime scene photo, it was just lying there, broken on the floor. I thought it was strange. It's not in the evidence logs, Harlow said. It's mentioned, but never processed. Abby gasped. It disappeared, or it was removed, Harlow said grimly. Along with what might have been on it, fingerprints, DNA. At his words, Ranger stepped forward again and pressed his nose to the photo, pawing anxiously. The room stilled. Mason turned to Ranger, wonder dawning in his eyes. What were you trying to tell us, boy? He whispered. The wall clock ticked to 10:50 a.m., 10 minutes until the stay expired. And still the truth clawed its way to the surface, guided by a dog who never forgot. Harlow's phone rang. He answered on the first ring. You're sure, he said, voice low tight. Verify the chain of custody. Yes. Contact Judge Larson. We need an emergency hearing. He turned to Mason and Abby, eyes blazing with urgency. The Rolex, someone signed it out 3 days after the murder, claiming they were from the DA's office. The signature matches Gregory Whitman. Mason froze. The prosecutor took evidence from my case. And there's more. Your leather jacket was found in deep storage. It had traces of a cleaning solution, industrial grade, the kind used to wipe blood and DNA. A silence fell like a dropped gavel. Ranger whined low and steady, as if confirming what they now knew. Someone used your jacket, Abby whispered. They planted evidence on it. The warden stepped in. It's 10:59. Harlow raised his phone. The governor's legal counsel is reviewing everything now. They waited. Each tick of the clock, a hammer blow. At 11:00 the phone rang. Warden Blackwood answered, voice flat and unreadable. After a long moment, she hung up. The governor has granted a 48-hour stay, pending an emergency hearing, she said. The room exhaled. Mason slumped back. The fight briefly paused. Ranger whimpered, tail brushing the floor, sensing the shift. Abby wiped tears from her face. What happens now, she asked. Now, Harlow said, gathering his files, we build an ironclad case. I'm going to find Wilson Grant. Outside, word of the stay spread like wildfire. Protesters doubled. Media vans encircled the gates. A car idled nearby, unseen by the crowd. Inside, it sat Judge Carlton Pierce, the same man who had presided over Mason's trial. He watched the chaos through tinted windows. His phone rang. We have a problem, said the voice on the other end. Harlow's digging into the Coastal Haven development. Found ties to zoning approvals. Pierce paled. Coastal Haven was the luxury project that had sailed through regulations, despite ecological protests, thanks to a consulting fee wired quietly to his offshore account. Handle it, Pierce hissed. It's not that simple anymore, the voice warned. Too many eyes. We may need to cut ties and let Whitman fall. The judge hung up, his gaze locked on the prison gates. Inside those walls, Mason Reed still breathed. And with him, the secrets someone had killed to bury. Back in Abby's cottage, Ranger lay by the front door, unmoving. His head rested on his paws, ears twitching at every creak, every sound that might be Mason coming home. Abby knelt beside him. I miss him too, boy. She stood and opened the closet where Mason's belongings had been carefully kept. The scent of old cologne rose like a memory. She reached for his navy dress uniform, still zipped inside the garment bag, untouched, since the day everything ended. Ranger didn't move until she began pulling boxes down. Then, slowly, he rose. His nose twitched. His tail flicked once. When she opened the last drawer, he padded forward and stopped. Then he pawed. The gesture was unmistakable. Abby followed his gaze to an old gym bag shoved beneath the bed, Mason's range bag from his security job. Ranger let out a low, urgent whine. Abby pulled the bag free, unzipped it. Inside, sweat-stained clothes, a towel, water bottles. Nothing unusual. But Ranger wouldn't stop. His nose buried in the corner seam, pawing, scratching. Abby froze. There, tucked into a tear in the lining, was something hard. She reached in and pulled out a tiny piece of metal, a broken watch stem, not just any stem. A gold crown, etched with an insignia she recognized from a dozen old photos. Victor Montgomery's Rolex. Her breath caught. Oh my God. She stared at the piece, the implications unraveling fast and cold. Ranger. She whispered, tears in her voice. You brilliant, brilliant boy. She snatched her phone and called Harlow, her hands trembling. Detective, it's Abby. I found something. You need to see this immediately. In the background, Ranger sat tall tale thumping once. His amber eyes locked on hers. He had waited 5 years. And now, finally, he had spoken in the only language he knew. 2 days later, the courthouse loomed like a monument to judgment. Outside news crews jostled for position, broadcasting every whisper. Reporters lined the marble steps. Protesters on both sides held signs aloft, some still calling for justice for Montgomery, others chanting Mason Reed's name. Inside courtroom 3B, Judge Marianne Winters adjusted her glasses. 62 years old, known for razor-sharp integrity, she carried none of Judge Pierce's shadows. This court recognizes the extraordinary nature of today's proceedings, she said, her voice cutting the murmurs. I expect facts. Only facts. A man's life is at stake. At the prosecution table, Gregory Whitman sat rigid. His skin was pale, his tie askew. Junior prosecutor Melissa Chen fidgeted beside him, her notes full of yellow flags and silent doubts. At the defense table, Mason Reed wore a gray suit borrowed from Reverend Sullivan, approved by the court. No shackles, no jumpsuit, just a man trying to stand tall again. Abby sat in the front row. Her hand rested gently on Ranger's head. The scarred German shepherd was there by court order, his role central to everything that followed. When Mason entered, Ranger rose at once, tail sweeping once, twice, as their eyes met across the room. All rise, the bailiff called. Your Honor, said Public Defender James Boucher, rising. We move to vacate Mr. Reed's conviction based on overwhelming new evidence pointing not just to reasonable doubt, but to a criminal conspiracy. Whitman stood, voice brittle. Your Honor, this is speculation. 11th hour attempts to relitigate a closed case. Judge Winters didn't flinch. Mr. Whitman, 2 days ago, this man was scheduled to die. There is no such thing as too late when a life hangs in the balance. She turned to Boucher. Proceed. And for the next hour, the courtroom listened as the original case against Mason Reed was torn apart. Piece by piece. The missing Rolex. The planted evidence. The gunpowder traces inconsistent with the stabbing. Phone records linking Wilson Grant to the crime scene. Montgomery's plan to expose corruption. Then Abby was called to testify. Abby stepped to the witness stand with steady legs but a racing heart. Ranger sat by the railing, his eyes locked on her. She spoke of the night of the murder, how Ranger had been agitated, how he'd fixated on Mason's jacket, how she'd dismissed it as playfulness, how years later that same agitation returned at the prison, at the sight of a scrap of leather at a photograph. Again and again he'd tried to speak in the only way he could. Most significantly, Your Honor, she said, holding up a clear evidence bag. Ranger led me to this. Inside the broken watch stem, unmistakably from Montgomery's missing Rolex. I found it hidden in Mason's old gym bag. Detective Harlow confirmed the match. It had been planted just like the evidence on Mason's jacket. Murmurs rippled through the courtroom. Judge Winters leaned forward. And you believe the dog knew? I believe he's been trying to protect Mason from the start, Abby said. From the night of the murder. From the moment they were separated. Ranger, sitting tall in the gallery, gave a single quiet bark. A confirmation. Detective Harlow took the stand next. He told the court how the original case had come together too neatly. How the Rolex had vanished from the logs. How the DA's signature appeared on the chain of custody for evidence that never returned. And then he named Wilson Grant, a known fixer, Harlow said, paid to retrieve files and silence Montgomery. Reed was framed as a convenient scapegoat. Why? Because he had been hired to upgrade Montgomery's security system. The next day, he might have found the incriminating evidence. Wittmann's cross-examination was sharp, even desperate. You built the original case. Now you're trying to undo your own work. Yes, Harlow replied without hesitation. Because I was wrong. And unlike some in this courtroom, I believe correcting injustice is my duty. The implication lingered in the air like smoke. Judge Winters called a recess. Mason was allowed a moment with Abby and Ranger. The German shepherd leaned into him, tail wagging gently. "You're the best detective in this case," Mason whispered. "Aren't you, boy?" Ranger licked his face once, then sat down ready. Because it wasn't over yet. When court resumed, the air felt electrified. "The defense calls Wilson," Grant Boucher announced. Gasps echoed as a thin, sharp-suited man in his 50s was escorted in by bailiffs. Grant's face was unreadable. He sat calm, controlled. "You were arrested yesterday, attempting to flee the country," Boucher began. "Is that correct?" "I invoke my Fifth Amendment right," Grant replied flatly. Boucher nodded. "You've been offered a plea agreement in exchange for testimony. The offer expires today." Grant glanced at Wittmann, then at Judge Winters. "Mr. Grant," the judge said, voice low, "an innocent man was nearly executed. The truth matters here." A silence. Then Grant exhaled. "I was hired to retrieve documents," he began. "Victor Montgomery planned to expose criminal corruption tied to the Coastal Haven development. I was paid to stop him." "Who hired you?" Boucher asked. Grant's voice remained cold. "Lawrence Shepard, Thomas Blackwell, and Judge Carlton Pierce." Gasps exploded. The courtroom shook with disbelief. The gavel slammed. Order restored. "The same Judge Pierce who oversaw this trial," Winters demanded. "Yes, Your Honor. He was financially invested. They needed Montgomery silenced." "And Mason," Reed Boucher pressed. "A scapegoat," Grant said. "He'd argued with Montgomery publicly. He had a jacket we could use. I took it from his car, used it to contaminate the scene. Planted the Rolex stem in his gym bag. The watch itself disposed of. The stem, insurance." He looked at Ranger. "I underestimated the dog." Wittmann sat pale, shrinking. "And the prosecutor?" Boucher asked. "Wittmann was pressured," Grant said. "Pierce made sure he buried evidence, the Rolex, the gunpowder report." When Grant was escorted out, the room remained stunned. Judge Winters removed her glasses. Her gaze found Mason. "Mr. Reed, please rise." Mason stood, shoulders squared, but shaking. "This court finds your conviction was built on misconduct, suppression, and conspiracy. I hereby vacate your conviction and order your immediate release. The state is barred from retrying this case." The gavel fell. Chaos. Reporters surged. Abby shoved through the crowd. Words failed. She reached him, clutched his hand. Ranger leapt between them, tail a blur, barking with joy. Mason dropped to one knee, arms wrapping around the dog who had saved his life not once, but twice. Outside the courthouse, the crowd roared as Mason stepped into daylight. Cameras flashed, reporters shouted, but none of it reached him. All he could see was Abby standing in the sun, her hand resting on her stomach, and Ranger pacing beside him, tail swishing in slow, steady arcs. Reverend Sullivan met them on the steps with a quiet smile. "God listens," he said simply. Mason nodded, his voice hoarse. "And sometimes he speaks through a dog." That night at home, Abby tucked the broken watch stem into a drawer beside a folded court order. Mason's release. The air in the house felt lighter, but not yet whole. Ranger wandered from room to room, inspecting, reacquainting. When he finally settled by the front door, he looked back only once, as if confirming that Mason was truly there. Mason stood barefoot in the hallway watching him. "You always knew," he whispered. "From the start." Ranger thumped his tail once, then rested his head on his paws, ears flicking toward the baby's quiet heartbeat in Abby's womb. Later, as the house slipped into silence, Abby turned to Mason. "What now?" Mason stared at the ceiling for a moment. Then he turned toward her, pulled her close. "Now we heal." Across the city, investigations erupted. Judge Pierce resigned under pressure. Whitman was indicted. Coastal Haven was frozen pending criminal review. And Detective Harlow, his badge heavy with both guilt and redemption, returned to the task force this time with a different fire in his eyes. The case of Mason Reed became more than a headline. It became a warning and a story of silence, of truth, and of a dog who never stopped waiting.